The sleek jet glided through the sky as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the cabin. Inside, the air was filled with luxury, from the plush leather seats to the golden accents that dotted the space. A sense of exclusivity hung in the air, and the passengers sat back, relaxing, feeling as though they were untouchable. Above the ordinary world outside, among the passengers was a woman named Jasmine Thomas. In her early 40s, Jasmine was the embodiment of grace and composure. Her tailored black blazer and neatly pressed slacks showcased her refined sense of style, but it was her calm demeanor that truly drew attention. She wasn't someone who sought the spotlight. Rather, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth, even if no one else did. As she entered the cabin, Jasmine took a brief look around, her eyes moving over the well-dressed passengers, her gaze lingering on the flight attendants who were moving swiftly down the aisle. Despite the elegant surroundings, there was something in the air, a subtle tension, a sense that everyone here was very much aware of the wealth and power that surrounded them. But what no one knew was that Jasmine wasn't just another wealthy woman taking a private flight. She was someone far more influential than anyone could have imagined. Jasmine preferred to keep her identity hidden for now. She wasn't here for attention, and that suited her just fine. In fact, she was comfortable in the anonymity her wealth afforded her. No one would guess that the woman sitting quietly in seat 3B was the CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the world, or that she owned not only this jet, but the entire fleet of planes that flew for the exclusive charter service she trusted. But as it often goes, not everyone shared her perspective on dignity and respect. Lauren, the head flight attendant, was a woman who prided herself on control. Her pristine uniform and perfectly coiffed hair told of her commitment to order, to keeping everything in line. To Lauren, appearances were everything. And it was clear to her that Jasmine didn't quite fit the mold of the elite passengers she was accustomed to serving. As Jasmine settled into her seat, placing her black leather bag under the chair in front of her, Lauren moved toward her with purpose. She had already been dismissive of the woman earlier, but now it was time to address what she perceived to be an issue. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lauren began, her tone polite but laced with condescension. "I believe you're in the wrong section." Jasmine looked up from her phone, meeting Lauren's gaze with an unblinking calm. "No, I'm in my seat," she replied, her voice steady. Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line as she surveyed the other passengers, taking note of their appearances. She had no doubt in her mind that Jasmine, with her understated elegance, was out of place. "This section is for our elite clientele," she insisted, her words sharp. Jasmine remained calm, her eyes never leaving Lauren's. "You might want to double-check your passenger list," she said, her tone still polite, but carrying an undercurrent of authority. But Lauren wasn't about to back down. "I know exactly who belongs here," she snapped. "And you don't?" The tension in the cabin thickened. Passengers, sensing the rising conflict, started to glance up from their phones or magazines, whispering to each other. Jasmine, however, remained seated, unfazed by the attention. Lauren, now visibly frustrated, crossed her arms and raised her voice so the other passengers could hear. "If you don't move to the back of the plane, I'll have to call security." Jasmine's response was calm and unwavering. "Call whoever you need to. I'm not moving." A few passengers exchanged confused looks, unsure of what was happening. Some whispered that maybe Jasmine had snuck into the wrong section, while others speculated she was trying to get an upgrade. Jasmine's composure only seemed to heighten the tension. Lauren, however, was growing increasingly agitated. "Grace," she barked at the junior flight attendant who stood nearby, looking unsure of what to do. "Escort her to the back of the plane." Grace hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously between Lauren and Jasmine, sensing that something wasn't right. But Lauren's sharp glare was enough to freeze her in place. She nodded reluctantly and stepped forward. As Grace made her way toward Jasmine, the older woman shifted in her seat slightly, her calm gaze never wavering. "You might want to think carefully about what you're doing," Jasmine warned softly. Lauren scoffed, brushing off the warning. "I know exactly what I'm doing. Now, get up," Jasmine simply replied. "No." The passengers in the cabin continued to watch, some growing uncomfortable as the situation unfolded. The socialite in the front of the plane leaned in to get a better look. Her curiosity piqued. while the businessman across the aisle frowned, clearly disturbed by the unfolding scene. "Why doesn't she just move?" one passenger muttered under his breath. "I think she's trying to sneak in for a free upgrade," another passenger whispered. Jasmine, however, ignored the growing murmurs. She kept her posture relaxed, her expression serene. She had faced bigger challenges in life than this petty power struggle, but she knew this wasn't about her seat. It was about something much larger. Lauren's voice rose again, louder this time. "I'm going to ask you one last time," she said, her tone sharp and commanding. "Move to the back of the plane, or I will call security." Jasmine simply replied, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm not moving." A few moments of silence followed. The passengers, most of whom had been watching in silent fascination, waited for something to break the tension. And then, just as they thought the standoff would continue, Jasmine did something unexpected. She picked up her phone, typed a quick message, and set it down. Lauren didn't notice the subtle shift in Jasmine's demeanor, but the tension in the cabin had become palpable. The passengers were all waiting for the moment when this exchange would reach its inevitable conclusion. Would Jasmine finally back down? Or would Lauren escalate things further? The moment was coming, and no one knew it yet, but the world they were flying in was about to change forever. The flight continued as the minutes ticked by, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. The soft hum of the engines and the ambient sound of passengers talking and sipping their drinks seemed to fade into the background. All eyes were on the scene unfolding before them. Lauren, standing in the aisle, was no longer trying to hide her frustration. Her eyes flared with anger, and her posture was rigid, as if trying to maintain the semblance of control she'd so desperately clung to. Her voice had already risen several times, but Jasmine remained unshaken, sitting in her seat, unbothered by the hostility and condescension being thrown her way. For a moment, it seemed as though Lauren had lost the will to push further. She turned away, busying herself with other passengers. But Jasmine's calmness had struck a chord deep within her. Her arrogance had clouded her judgment, and now she had to make an example of Jasmine. Without another word, Lauren stalked off down the aisle, but only for a moment. As she walked by, her gaze locked onto Jasmine's leg, slightly extended into the aisle, a seemingly innocent shift, but one that would prove to be a catalyst for what was about to happen. The sudden movement was deliberate. Lauren's foot struck Jasmine's leg with a sharp and sudden force, causing the tray she was holding to tilt. The glasses of water that had been precariously balanced tipped over, splashing onto Jasmine's lap and spilling across the floor. Lauren's reaction was swift and dramatic. Her face turned red as she gasped loudly, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "Watch where you're putting your legs," she snapped, her voice cutting through the cabin like a whip. "You've caused a mess." Jasmine, unflinching, looked up slowly. She brushed the water off her lap, her expression remaining calm. The other passengers, who had been holding their breath during the tense exchange, could feel the weight of what was happening. This was no longer just a disagreement about seats. It had escalated into something personal. "You walked into my leg," Jasmine responded calmly, her voice steady but firm. There was no anger, no sharpness in her words. Just an undeniable truth. "I've only asked to be treated with the same respect as everyone else," she continued. "And if that's too much to ask, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The words hung in the air like a blade, cutting through the tension. Lauren faltered. For the first time, her confidence wavered, and something in her expression shifted. It was as if she hadn't expected the quiet defiance from the woman she had so easily dismissed. But before she could respond, a loud slap echoed through the cabin. The sound reverberated against the walls, shocking everyone into silence. Lauren had struck Jasmine across the face. The room seemed to freeze. The air thickened with disbelief, and the passengers could do little more than watch in stunned silence as the consequences of Lauren's actions unfolded before them. A few people gasped in horror. A businessman seated across the aisle stood halfway, his face contorted in disbelief and disgust. Even Grace, the younger flight attendant, stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth in horror at what had just occurred. Jasmine, however, sat there for a moment, utterly still. Her hand rested calmly on her lap, her expression unchanged. The slap had not shaken her. Her eyes, unwavering, locked onto Lauren's. The cabin was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the plane as it soared through the air. For a moment, there was a silence so deep, so heavy, that even Lauren seemed to hesitate. But then, Jasmine spoke, Her voice was calm, steady, and undeniably powerful. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," she said softly. The words hit Lauren like a ton of bricks. Her face drained of color as the weight of what she had just done began to sink in. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood, still trying to regain some form of control over the situation. But it was too late. Jasmine had already sent a message. A quiet but deliberate move that would soon come to haunt Lauren in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The balance of power had shifted. No longer was Lauren the one in control. Jasmine's composed demeanor, her unspoken authority, had turned the tables in an instant. The passengers, still watching in silence, began to murmur among themselves. It was clear now that this wasn't just an isolated incident. What had started as a confrontation over a seat had morphed into a much larger story, one of respect, dignity, and accountability. Lauren stood there, frozen for a moment, her face pale. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. There was no turning back. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. She had just slapped a woman who wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't just someone who could be bullied or dismissed. Jasmine wasn't some faceless figure. She was someone with power, influence, and the resources to make sure that her actions wouldn't go unnoticed. Lauren's attempt to maintain control faltered as she turned toward the front of the plane, looking for an escape. She didn't have the courage to face Jasmine, not anymore. Instead, she moved briskly down the aisle, her footsteps sharp and hurried, though her composure had shattered. But Jasmine, in her stillness, had already calculated her next move. Her eyes remained on Lauren, unwavering. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, and didn't react the way Lauren had expected. Instead, she exuded quiet strength, a force that had left the flight attendants, the passengers, and even Lauren herself struggling to come to terms with what had just transpired. Jasmine's calm gaze lingered on Lauren for a moment before she picked up her phone. Typing something quickly, she set it down again, her actions deliberate, but her expression unreadable. And then, the silence returned. But it wasn't the silence of tension or uncertainty. It was the silence of control. At that moment, something shifted. The passengers, who had been quietly observing, now exchanged looks, some with raised eyebrows, others with subtle nods of approval. They had witnessed something powerful, something that transcended the petty squabbles of the rich and entitled. And yet, as Jasmine sat back in her seat, no one knew what was coming next. The plane hummed along in the sky, the tension thick in the air. And for the first time, the flight attendants felt uneasy. Grace, the younger attendant, stood near the galley, her hands still trembling from the scene she had just witnessed. Her eyes darted nervously between the passengers, unable to shake off the chilling reality that had just unfolded. She had been a silent witness, unsure whether to step in or stay out of the drama that had erupted between Lauren and Jasmine. But now, with the air crackling with an ominous energy, she knew that things were far from over. As Lauren continued her duties, she couldn't shake the feeling that the universe had just tipped the scales in a way she couldn't quite explain. Her earlier confidence had completely dissolved, and though she tried to mask it with forced professionalism, the nagging sensation that she had crossed an irreversible line gnawed at her. Every time her gaze drifted toward Jasmine, who sat there, poised and calm, as if nothing had happened. It felt as though the walls were closing in around her. She couldn't get the image of Jasmine's unwavering gaze out of her mind. And for the first time, she questioned her own actions. Jasmine remained unfazed. The brief altercation, the slap, had done nothing to disturb her. Her posture was immaculate, her presence serene. She had been calm when Lauren had tried to bully her, and she remained composed even after the slap. What Lauren failed to realize was that Jasmine wasn't just the woman she had attempted to humiliate. She was the very embodiment of power that Lauren hadn't bothered to recognize, and that power was about to be felt by everyone on board. Jasmine had already taken the steps to handle the situation, quietly and efficiently. The moment she had sent that message from her phone, she knew the storm was about to hit, but she wasn't in a hurry. She didn't need to raise her voice, escalate the situation, or do anything dramatic. Her silence, her calm demeanor, was the weapon she needed. In a world where people assumed power was shown through noise and force, Jasmine was a reminder that real strength often lay in stillness and grace. As the plane cruised higher, the pilot emerged from the cockpit, his face pale. He glanced around the cabin with a mixture of concern and disbelief. When his eyes locked with Jasmine's, the realization hit him like a thunderclap. He knew immediately who she was. He approached Lauren with quick, purposeful steps. "Lauren, you need to step aside," he said, his voice firm, yet tinged with discomfort. Lauren turned to face him, her expression one of confusion. "What is this about?" she asked, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "The management just contacted me. Miss Thomas." He paused, looking at Jasmine, "is the owner of this aircraft, and she's not someone you should be treating this way." The words hit Lauren like a brick. Her face turned an alarming shade of red as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She had slapped the woman who owned the plane. She had humiliated herself and tarnished her reputation with a single impulsive action. A wave of panic rose inside her chest as she looked around the cabin, hoping for some sort of support, some sign that maybe this was all a mistake. But the passengers weren't on her side. The businessman from across the aisle was shaking his head in disappointment. The socialite, who had initially whispered about Jasmine, was now visibly uncomfortable. And Grace? Poor, nervous Grace could barely meet her gaze. The pilot, undeterred by Lauren's attempts to speak, turned to address the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and prepare for descent." Whispers filled the cabin as passengers exchanged confused glances. Why were they landing early? Was there some sort of emergency? The hum of the engines seemed louder now, as though everything had shifted, and no one could escape the feeling that something big was happening. Minutes later, the plane touched down smoothly. A sleek black SUV was already waiting on the tarmac, its driver standing at attention, holding the door open. Two sharply dressed assistants emerged from the vehicle with brisk, purposeful steps. Climbing the stairs to the plane, they didn't look at anyone, their focus entirely on the woman seated near the front of the cabin. "Miss Thomas," one of them said, her voice respectful but firm. "Everything is ready for your review." Jasmine stood slowly, gracefully, as though nothing had disturbed her. She straightened her blazer and adjusted her stance. The passengers watched in stunned silence as Jasmine moved with the kind of deliberate control that left no room for doubt. Lauren, however, stood frozen, her face drained of color as the truth of the situation sank in. She had slapped the woman who owned the plane, and now the consequences were coming to her in full force. One of the assistants turned toward Lauren and addressed her without a hint of emotion. "Lauren," she said, her tone cutting through the tension, "you're no longer needed here." Lauren's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her body trembled with the realization that she had been caught in the very web of arrogance and prejudice she had woven for herself. Jasmine turned her gaze toward her. "Lauren," she said, her voice cutting through the air with an authority that no one could ignore. "Your behavior today has been disgraceful. You've not only humiliated me, but you've also damaged the reputation of this airline." Lauren stammered, her face pale. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." Jasmine didn't give her a chance to finish. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to show me the basic respect that every passenger deserves," she said coldly. "You assumed things about me based on my appearance. You let your prejudice cloud your judgment. And now, because of that, you've ruined your career." The assistants stepped forward, their eyes cold and professional. "Lauren Reed, you are fired," one of them declared, her voice final. Lauren's eyes widened, and her body went numb. She staggered back, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what to do next. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their silent judgment heavier than any words could express. The businessman across the aisle gave her one final look, his disapproval clear, but his expression unreadable. Before Lauren could say another word, two uniformed police officers boarded the plane. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder as the officers made their way toward Lauren. "Miss Thomas," one of the officers said, his voice respectful, "we received your report. Are you pressing charges?" Jasmine looked up at him, her eyes steady and unwavering. "Yes," she said simply. "I want her held accountable for assaulting me in front of multiple witnesses." Lauren took a step back, her face contorted in disbelief. "No, this is a misunderstanding. I didn't mean it. Please," she cried, her voice breaking, but it was too late. The officers moved quickly, cuffing Lauren's hands behind her back. She gasped, her breathing quickening as she realized that there was no escape. This was the moment of reckoning, and there was no turning back. Jasmine remained calm, watching the scene unfold with quiet authority. As the officers led Lauren away, she turned to the passengers, addressing them with a soft, measured voice. "I apologize for what you had to witness today," Jasmine said, her words carrying a quiet power. "This is not the standard of service I expect on my aircraft. Moving forward, I will ensure that every passenger is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." A round of applause broke out among the passengers. Mr. Raymond, who had been watching quietly, offered a nod of approval. Mrs. Raymond, her knitting forgotten, clapped politely. Jasmine smiled faintly and turned to Grace, the young flight attendant who had quietly supported her throughout the ordeal. "Grace," she said softly, "I noticed your professionalism today. Thank you for stepping up when it mattered." Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "Thank you, Miss Thomas," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. With a final, graceful nod, Jasmine turned and made her way toward the door, her assistants following close behind. The passengers, now fully aware of the power and poise that had defined the moment, watched her leave, knowing they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. As Jasmine stepped off the plane, the world around her seemed to fade. The fresh air of the tarmac hit her, and her mind turned to the lessons learned that day. For Jasmine, the true victory wasn't in the power she wielded, it was in the message she had sent. That respect and dignity weren't privileges, but rights, that every person deserved to be treated with kindness, no matter their appearance or station. And as the jet soared back into the sky, Jasmine looked ahead, knowing that she had just begun a journey that would ripple far beyond this flight. A journey that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others who had witnessed her quiet strengths. In the end, Jasmine had proven that sometimes the most powerful victories weren't about asserting dominance. They were about inspiring change.